How's it? And welcome to this video where we're going to talk about GitHub Pages. I'm pretty sure everyone's familiar with GitHub Pages, but in case you're not, basically what GitHub Pages allows you to do is to host static websites on GitHub for free. Lots of people host their blogs this way. You're allowed to run some dynamic sites, but mostly it's sort of static sites that get hosted. So let's dive in and see the various ways that you can interact with GitHub Pages. Now the first one, the most common one, in this case you can see I have a very basic HTML page. It looks something like this. It just says documentation and then there's a couple of posts. Now what we're going to want to do is head over to settings in our repo. We head over to pages. We're going to go to branch and say we want to deploy from our main branch, and the path we want to deploy from is docs. We're going to hit save. Okay, now that we've done that, we can head back to code. You can see we have this deployment over here. You click on GitHub Pages, takes us to the deployment, and the latest deployment has a URL. Click on that URL and we have our content. Okay, so for our next method, we're going to compile some static HTML, and then we're going to serve that HTML. And for this, we're going to use this community extension, GitHub Pages deploy action. And we're also going to use the base of a template that we use at SSW for our ADRs, which is our architecture decision records. And for that, we've got a little bit of config in the root that says sort of where the ADRs are. And then if we look at our docs, you see our README. It shows that if you want to get this running locally, you just install Log4Brains, and then you just run Log4Brains preview. And when you do that with what we've got here at the moment, you get this that pops up. This shows you your different architecture decision records, and as you go, sort of they'll be posted down here. That part's not super important for right now. What we want to look at is the pipeline. So we start off by triggering on main when the ADR folder changes, when the config in the root changes, or when the workflow itself changes. We give the GitHub token contains write permissions. We then check out the code, set up node, run the install and the build for Log4Brains, and then we use that same community extension. We say publish to a branch called ADR docs from this path on disk. So when this outputs, it will get put into that path. The target path in this branch is the root. There's the token that gets passed in for the workflow, and then we've given it some config that it needs to use as the email and display name for the commit. So if we go over to GitHub and see what that looks like, you'll see that we've got this extra branch, and if we switch to that branch, you see the contents looks completely different, and this is that static site. So to go make our configuration changes, we'll go over to pages, and we'll say deploy from branch, change that to ADR docs. And this time we want to deploy from the root. Go ahead and click save. Now in the background, what that would have done is kicked off another workflow to go redeploy our docs again. And after a little bit of running, that will complete, and you can see we've got our URL again. Okay, and that loads up, but you'll see that this looks a bit broken, and the reason for that is I've missed some config here. So what we need to do is for the base path, we want to pass in the repo name. And the reason for that is if we look here currently, if I just open up one of these images, you can see that the path it's looking for is directly off the root. Now we will switch this back a bit later when I show you how this works for enterprises, because that's pretty cool if you didn't know the differences of how they can work. Stick around for that. But yeah, we're going to go and switch this to say use the repo name so that it knows that this doesn't run off the root, it actually runs off a folder. I'm going to say add GitHub repo name to wait for our build to complete. And when that does, because it had published new code into that ADR docs folder, it triggers the pages to redeploy. So we'll wait for that to complete. And when that's done, we should be able to see our site with images and everything working again. Okay, so you'll notice that our images load, both of these images, but you'll see that our ADR still don't show. And to get this to work, we need to create a magic file. And what that magic file is that in our pipeline, we need to go and create a file called, so we're going to do touch this path. So the reason we want this is that GitHub hosts the pages using Jekyll, and this little file is going to allow it to serve our underscore files. So if you refresh this, you'll see there's a bunch of pages here with underscore next, and that's where it stores all the JavaScript and the CSS. So we want those to load. So we're just going to go and touch this file, which is obviously going to put it in this output directory. And then when that gets copied up, it's going to be in our branch. And then with that file there, GitHub will go and serve our underscore next folders. And once that's all deployed, you can see that we now have our architecture decision records sitting at our URL, and everything loads as expected. Now, although this works perfectly fine, it does feel very messy having this branch hang around the whole time called ADR docs. It especially feels messy because the contents of this branch has nothing to do with what the main branch is. And that just feels like a smell to me. So how do we fix this? Well, we can go and use the same extension to publish this to a new repo. So what we'll do is we'll publish it to the same repo name, just -ADRs. For that, we'll change the branch name to be main. And in order to do this, we're going to need a more elevated token. So we just call this ADR token. And we'll go and check this in. We'll say update pipeline to publish to new repo. Obviously right now it's going to fail, so we'll go and fix that up. Go into our settings, go to secrets. We're going to create a new secret called ADR GitHub token. We're going to create a new empty repo just with that same name so that it exists so long. And then we're going to create a fine-grained token for my account, this repo specifically, so it'll only have access to that ADR's repo. And then we'll give it access to content read and write. I'll go ahead and generate that. Then we'll copy that token, update our secret. And then all we need to do now is go and rerun that action that would have failed. We're just going to say rerun failed jobs. So once that build's completed, we'll head back over to our other repo and refresh it. And you can see our contents is now in that repo. Now, obviously, with only making these changes, nothing's going to change with the way our GitHub pages work. So we need to go reconfigure our GitHub pages for this repo. So again, we go to pages. This time we'll build off the main branch. And again, we'll say off the root. And we'll click save. In the background, just like before, if we go to actions, that's going to start our build for us. Okay, so if we go look at this site when it's finished, again, you'll see this doesn't work. And the reason for it this time is that our path is pointing to the old repo. So our images are still working. And the reason for that is that the old site's still working. But our new path that we want this to run as is /ADRs. So remember, this is running under the main repo, which has just got sort of the normal name like this. And then the pages is running out of one that's got a -ADRs. So we just say add -ADRs. So when that's finished building, then all the resources will load directly out of that repo. So while that's busy going though, let's go and do some cleanup. So obviously we're not using the GitHub pages that runs from this repo anymore. So we're going to go and say none and click save. So what that's going to do is that's going to switch off the GitHub pages that we used to have running here. And just to go and illustrate what I was saying earlier, if we go and refresh this page, you can see that those images no longer load. So we'll have to wait for that build to finish. And when it does, we can go ahead to this page, reload it, our images are back, our JavaScript's loading again, the rest of our styles are all loading in, and everything works just as expected. So although this works just as we would expect, it's still a bit messy. We have our main repo here, and then we have our second repo, which we don't even contribute to. It just hosts content for our GitHub page under a different repo. Now, if we have 50 different projects, and those 50 different projects all have their own ADRs, this could get a bit messy quite fast. So what's another alternative? Well, we don't have to use this at all. So let's go ahead and delete this. So there's our ADR repo deleted. We'll go back into our normal GitHub repo. And you'll see that there is another option under the GitHub Pages, which has existed for quite some while, well, quite some time, should I say, which is to use GitHub Actions. And you can see here this says this is best for using frameworks and customizing your build process. So when we switch to this, so one thing that you'll notice here, you'll see that it by default gives us some workflows that we can go and configure that will get this whole process running. But I already know what to configure, so I'm just going to go back into this process and configure it myself. So all we'll need to do is run this setup pages. And then along with running the setup pages, I'm going to go and update the permissions, and I'm going to say that I want to give it pages rights and also ID token rights. Now I'm no longer going to need this action to my deployment, so I'll go and delete that. This won't be running with Jekyll anymore, so I can go and delete that. Because this action is not getting run, I can go and delete that. And for this to work, I'm now going to be uploading an artifact. So you can see I'm uploading that same output artifact. Also, with me not using an ADRs repo, I should empty that out. And then you can see we now have a deployment job here. So something that you would have, or that we showed before, well, that I showed before, was that there was a deployment job that did the actual deployment of the GitHub pages. But this whole time, a workflow hasn't physically existed in our repo. That was sort of a shadow workflow that was running for us, enabling that deployment. Now we're not going to have that anymore. Instead, we're going to have complete control. We're going to run that inside our own pipeline. So in this pipeline, we're going to have an environment called GitHub Pages. This is going to need build, which is up here. So when that build is finished, then this will kick off. And all this is going to do is say deploy pages. And then it will output, or it will set the URL to the output of this deployment ID step and the page underscore URL variable. So let's go check this in and see what happens. So with that checked in, our build kicked off as expected. Let's see how it goes. So after a bit that finishes, and we can go and open up this URL, and you can see everything is published again under this same repo that we have our source code in, but more importantly, it's now using proper artifacts as part of the release, and then a deployment. So something that you'll see now, or you've seen earlier as well, is we've got the GitHub Pages deployment here. If we click on that, that'll show us all our different deployments that have gone previously. And then it also has the link up top here where we can easily click to get back to the path that we're at. Okay, so let's recap where we are. We first looked at basic HTML pages. Then we looked at the option of instead publishing to a second branch where we could have generated content. We then looked at, instead of having a second branch, rather publishing to a new repository, where it was a lot more clear of where the doc site was versus the code repo. And then we looked at using GitHub Actions and publishing to artifacts and following a more traditional deployment pipeline. So the benefits of using the basic HTML is it was very easy to set up. It runs off the main branch, but the con is that it's static HTML. When we published to the second branch, this was great because it now allowed us to use generated content. It only required a small bit of config. If you remember, we changed the path to be to a different branch and then off the root instead of being off the docs repo from main. But it was a bit messy because it required us to have a branch that was going to sit around long term. When we moved to a new repository, this is still allowed for generated content. It meant that we could keep the branches clean in our main repo, so we didn't have that sort of ADR docs branch anymore. But this required us to have a pat token that we had to maintain and renew every, say, 30 days or 180 days, whatever that cycle was, which is not ideal. And with us publishing to a new repo, this could easily have a repo sprawl. So if we, like I mentioned, if we had 50 repos and all of them needed ADRs, we'd end up with 100 repos, and then it just creates a lot of mess. And then lastly, when we looked at GitHub Actions and using the artifacts there and doing a sort of traditional deployment pipeline, this again still allowed for generated content. We still kept the branches clean. There was no pat maintenance because we're using the standard artifact pipeline. And then, as I've mentioned now, because this is a sort of standard deployment, it's sort of what we used to when we do our deployments. There's sort of nothing out of the ordinary. However, there is package storage that we have to consider. So in my demos, my repos are public, and therefore I'm not charged for package storage. If you had closed source, then you would be charged for the amount of package storage that you use from those artifacts. Now that I mentioned closed source, how does this work for closed source? Well, if you look at the GitHub Pages or the GitHub Docs, it says that it's free if you have sort of GitHub free for your public repos. And if you're using a paid tier, so GitHub Pro, Team, Enterprise Cloud, or Enterprise Server, then you can use Pages for both your public and your private repos. Okay, so let's look at a closed source example. Currently, as you can see, this repo is public and it's under my Gordon Beaming sort of individual user account. To test this out, I'm just going to transfer the repo quickly across to my org account. Okay, now that it's in the org, I'm going to go and change the visibility. I'm going to switch it to internal. Now that it's set as internal, I'm going to go make sure the pages is configured still. You can see now that when we get to the pages configuration, it says, how do you want the visibility for this? So do you want this to be public? So even though our code is private, we can say that the website itself, so when we publish our ADRs, we want the ADRs themselves to be public. In our case, I'm going to say that I want the ADRs to be private, and we'll leave the source here as GitHub Actions. And you can see here, it says that our site's already live. So let's go ahead and take a look at this. Okay, so when we switch it to private, you'll notice that the URL that we're given looks very different to the one that we previously had. So if we go ahead and open this, I mean, you didn't see it there, it was very quick, but there was actually a whole auth cycle that happened, making sure that I can only see this if I am authenticated. So if I go and grab this URL and go to in private window, and I try to go to the URL again, you see that I'm asked to sign in. So the normal URL that we're used to going to, which looks something like this, so it's got the org name or the individual's names or handle, then .github.io/repo name. That path will still work. It's just, it will redirect onto our secure and our site that requires login. And again, for the same site, if I go to in private window and I try browse to it there, you can see that again I'm asked to log in. And if we wanted to change that behavior, all we need to do is switch this to public. And you can see if I switch it to public, the URL changes and it loads perfectly fine. And if we test it in an in private window, that loads perfectly fine as well. I'm going to switch that back to private quickly. And now something that you may have noticed earlier is that again, our images aren't loading and our ADRs aren't loading. Now this is a quick fix. And the reason for this change is because now we're running off the root. So if you remember from much earlier in the video, I had said that we needed to make that small adjustment, and don't worry, we'll be switching it back. This is that point where we'll be switching it back. So if we go back and look at that code, here's that path. We're just going to go and say this runs off the root. It doesn't run off another directory anymore. Back over to our repo. Let this build and deploy quickly. And now that's done, we can go ahead and refresh this again. You see that our images come back and our ADRs come back. Everything works as we would expect. So I'm going to leave this repo in a public visibility so that you can go and grab any of this code if you want. You will notice that once this is public, you can only have the output of this page as public as well, so you can't have public source and then private site, which feels reasonable. That's all I wanted to share with you today on GitHub Pages. I hope you found some of it useful. I try to cover every different angle that I can think of, at least across the basics of GitHub Pages. If you think of something else that you wish I would have shared that I didn't, please leave them down below in the comments. Otherwise, yeah, remember to leave a like and subscribe if you aren't already. Share this with your friends. Until next time, cheers.